An urgent blockade of Tiraspol has begun. Transnistria is being cut off from Moscow. Russians have found themselves trapped there. It has happened. Moldova and Ukraine are tightening the fist of revenge.
Russia wants to deploy 10,000 soldiers to Moldova and install a pro-Russian government.
As we've seen in their plans, when we heard their rhetorics, definitely we was targeted and was considered as a next target.
On January 1st, 2026, a Russian sentry at the Kuchurgan border crossing shivered in the cold, completely unaware that his watch had just shifted from a routine patrol to a prison sentence. For the past 3 decades, this checkpoint had been a porous membrane, a gateway for gray market goods and rotation protocols that kept Moscow's influence alive in the heart of Eastern Europe. But as the digital clock flickered over to the new year, the geopolitical locks slammed shut with a finality that echoed all the way to the Kremlin. The 1,500 Russian soldiers stationed in the breakaway region of Transnistria woke up that morning believing they were the vanguard of a new Russian empire, the tip of the spear aimed at Moldova's heart. They were wrong. In exactly 60 seconds of coordinated bureaucratic maneuvering, they had become the world's most heavily armed hostages. This wasn't a kinetic strike involving high-explosive ordnance or drone swarms. It was a masterclass in strangulation logistics. The Ukrainian and Moldovan governments had just synchronized their border controls to absolute zero, turning a 450-kilometer stretch of land into a hermetically sealed airlock. Not a single crate of ammunition, not a liter of diesel, and certainly not a fresh recruit could pass through. The sentry checking his breath against the winter air didn't know it yet, but he was no longer a soldier of the Russian Federation. He was an inmate in an open-air facility where the warden spoke Romanian and Ukrainian, and the only way out was surrender. To understand why this specific moment on the calendar matters more than a dozen tank battles, you have to look at the map through the eyes of a paranoid Kremlin strategist. Vladimir Putin's grand design was never just about seizing land. It was about constructing a buffer empire, a Soviet-style architecture of loyalist zones that would keep NATO at arm's length. Ukraine, Moldova, and the sliver of land known as Transnistria were the load-bearing pillars of this project. For years, planners in Moscow viewed Chisinau not as a sovereign capital, but as the final western bastion of the Novorossiya project. The operational plan was brutally simple and, on paper, strategically sound. Once Odessa fell to Russian naval infantry, the land bridge would extend seamlessly to Tiraspol, connecting the breakaway region to the mothership and sealing off Ukraine from the Black Sea entirely. It was supposed to be a triumphant reunion. Instead, that dream collided with the cold, hard physics of modern warfare. The failure to take Odessa didn't just stall the offensive, it isolated the Transnistria garrison in a way that military history rarely sees. This is what experts call a bloodless siege. But don't let the gentle name fool you. It is a slow-motion asphyxiation that is arguably crueler than direct combat because it removes the soldier's primary purpose, the ability to fight back. The Russian troops are now trapped in a geographic cage, with a hostile Ukraine to the east and a rapidly westernizing Moldova to the west, effectively checkmated by border guards and customs officers rather than artillery. Let's talk about the hardware, because that is where the tragedy of the Russian position becomes almost comical. The units operating under the banner of the Russian peacekeeping force in Transnistria have been rotting in place since 1992. In modern warfare, an army is a living organism that consumes supplies at a terrifying rate. A single mechanized battalion requires tons of consumables every single day just to remain distinct from a parking lot of scrap metal. But the logistics lifelines that fed this organism have been severed with surgical precision. The gray trade routes, those shadowy networks of bribery, smuggling, and diplomatic immunity that allowed Moscow to sneak in spare parts and night vision goggles, have evaporated. On the Moldovan side, the border isn't just closed, it is fortified with mobile patrols and a newfound political will that refuses to be bought. Imagine trying to maintain a combat-ready force when you cannot replace a broken firing pin or a cracked tank tread. The equipment these 1,500 soldiers are guarding is largely Soviet heritage, leftovers from the Cold War that are rapidly turning into rust. Western intelligence reports suggest that the operational group of Russian forces is now cannibalizing its own vehicles for parts, a desperate practice that signals the death spiral of any military unit. They are sitting on arguably the largest ammunition depot in Eastern Europe at Cobasna. Yet they might as well be armed with muskets because the logistical chain required to utilize that firepower effectively has been deleted from reality. The situation on the ground reveals a level of degradation that would make a drill sergeant weep. What makes a military force viable is not just the kinetic energy of its weapons, but the psychological continuity of its personnel. Russian commanders in Tiraspol are currently radioing Moscow for orders, but the only transmission coming back is a strategic version of "please hold." There is no cavalry coming over the hill. An air bridge is statistically suicidal. Any Russian Il-76 transport plane attempting to drop supplies would have to fly through some of the densest air defense networks on the planet, courtesy of Ukrainian S-300s and Western supplied systems. They are effectively marooned on an island of land, cut off from the mothership by an ocean of hostile airspace. This reality has stripped the Russian soldier of his most vital armor, the belief that he is part of a superpower. Instead, he is indistinguishable from the local militia, wearing fading fatigues and conserving fuel because he knows the tanker truck isn't coming back next week. The peacekeepers have become prisoners of peace, forced to watch their operational readiness degrade by 0.5% every single day that the blockade holds. It is a lesson in entropy. Without the injection of energy from the outside, the system collapses into disorder, and the silence from the Kremlin is the loudest sound in the barracks right now. But the military strangulation is just the opening act. The real kill shot, the one that keeps analysts in Chisinau and Kiev awake at night with excitement, is the energy weapon. For decades, the separatist region of Transnistria didn't exist because of its economic prowess or its cultural distinctiveness. It existed because it was on life support hooked up to a gas line from Gazprom. Russia pumped natural gas into the region effectively for free, a subsidy worth billions of dollars over the years. This gas was the lifeblood of the regime. It was burned in the massive Kushurgan power station to generate electricity, which was then sold to Moldova. It was a perfect parasitic loop. Russia gave free gas, Transnistria turned it into power, sold the power for hard currency, and used that cash to finance the separatist government and the security services. It was an unlimited credit card with no payment due date. However, Ukraine's decision to halt Russian gas transit through its territory in 2025 didn't just cut the flow, it snapped the credit card in half. Without that free gas, the heavy industry that forms the backbone of the Transnistrian economy grinds to a halt. The steel mills go cold, the cement plants stop spinning, and most importantly, the revenue stream that pays the salaries of the police, the bureaucrats, and those 1,500 Russian soldiers dries up instantly. This economic implosion creates a scenario that is far more terrifying to Moscow than a tank assault. It is the prospect of self-destruction from within. When the money runs out, the chain of loyalty that binds the local elites to the Kremlin corrodes faster than the steel in their depots. We are watching a sociological experiment play out in real time. What happens to a puppet state when the puppet master stops pulling the strings? The people on the streets of Tiraspol, who have spent 30 years under the heavy blanket of Russian propaganda, are no longer looking at the sky waiting for Russian paratroopers. They are looking at their empty wallets. The question circulating in the cafes and markets has shifted from, "Will Russia save us?" to a far more dangerous, "Has Russia forgotten us?" This psychological collapse is the precursor to political surrender. You can station tanks on every corner, but you cannot force a population to remain loyal when they can't heat their homes or buy bread because the ruble-backed economy has evaporated. The region is effectively bankrupt, operating on fumes and the inertia of history. And just like a company that cannot make payroll, the separatist regime is facing a hostile takeover, not by soldiers, but by the undeniable gravity of economic reality. Don't you find the irony delicious? One of the planet's proclaimed superpowers, a nation with thousands of nuclear warheads and a seat on the UN Security Council, has been rendered impotent to resupply a garrison less than a day's drive from its own border. This blockade has exposed the hollow core of Russian power projection. When the invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, television pundits and armchair generals predicted that Russian armor would sweep across the Dniester River and swallow Moldova whole within weeks. Today, we are staring at the inverse of that prediction. We see soldiers who are poorly equipped, demoralized, and largely recruited from the local population because Moscow cannot rotate in professional contract soldiers. Intelligence reports indicate that a significant percentage of these Russian troops are actually Transnistrian locals who hold Russian passports but have never set foot in Red Square. They signed up for the steady paycheck, not for a last stand against NATO-trained special forces. If a conflict were to break out tomorrow, the durability of this force is highly questionable. Would a local boy from Tiraspol really die for a commander in Moscow who can't even send him a fresh pair of boots? The Kremlin knows the answer to that question, and it is terrified of the world finding out. At this point, we need to shift our focus from the paralyzed giant to the agile player on the other side of the chessboard, Moldova and its Iron Lady, Maia Sandu. In the geopolitical history of the last 30 years, Chisinau has played the role of the nervous younger sibling, flinching at every sudden movement from Moscow. The standard operating procedure was submission. When the Kremlin frowned, Moldovan delegations would rush to Moscow, hats in hand, begging, "Please don't cut off our gas." It was a relationship defined by fear and dependency. But today, the dynamic has inverted completely. We are witnessing a leader who looks at the Russian bear, sees that it is caught in a trap of its own making, and calmly says, "If there is a referendum, I will vote yes to uniting with Romania." That statement isn't just a soundbite for the evening news. It is a diplomatic hand grenade tossed into the middle of the Kremlin's strategic planning room. By putting unification on the table, Sandu is effectively threatening to delete the border that Russia has spent decades trying to control. Uniting with Romania isn't just about cultural heritage. It is a legal loophole that would instantly transport Moldova under the nuclear umbrella of NATO and the economic fortress of the European Union. It transforms the Transnistria issue from a domestic squabble into an Article 5 crisis for Brussels and Washington. Where does this sudden surge of courage come from? It isn't magic. It is the calculated confidence of a poker player who has seen her opponent's cards and realized he is bluffing. Ironically, Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine has done more to accelerate Moldova's westward trajectory than 3 decades of EU diplomacy ever could. The invasion was supposed to be a display of shock and awe that would freeze Eastern Europe in terror. Instead, it broke the psychological spell of Russian invincibility. During the elections of 2024 and 2025, Moscow emptied its pockets to stop this shift. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars funneled into gray accounts, a tsunami of cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure, and disinformation campaigns so dense they practically had their own gravitational pull. Russian intelligence operatives worked overtime to buy votes and sow chaos, treating the Moldovan electorate like a commodity to be purchased. Yet, despite this massive investment in hybrid warfare, Sandu retained her seat. Her survival was the clearest signal yet that the Moldovan people have recalibrated their internal compasses. They are no longer tuning their radios to Moscow frequencies. They are looking to Brussels, realizing that the Russian world offers nothing but stagnation and isolation. The economic data tells an even more damning story for Russia's Russian World project. While the Kremlin was busy drawing red lines on maps, the invisible hand of the market was erasing them. Transnistria, the supposed bastion of Soviet nostalgia, has quietly drifted into the economic orbit of the European Union. It is one of the great ironies of this conflict that while Tiraspol flies the hammer and sickle, its factories are kept alive by European consumers. More than 80% of the region's exports now flow into EU markets. The steel produced in separatist mills builds skyscrapers in Europe. The textiles sewn in Tiraspol dress consumers in Italy and Germany. This economic reality has created a schizophrenia among the Transnistrian elite. The business owners and oligarchs who actually run the region are facing a brutal dilemma. Do they sink with the Titanic that is the Russian economy, or do they grab the life raft offered by Chisinau and Europe? When Ukraine cut the gas transit, the myth of free energy evaporated, and with it, the last economic argument for loyalty to Moscow. The people of Transnistria woke up to a bitter realization. Putin's empty promises about Slavic brotherhood do not generate kilowatts, and they certainly don't put food on the table. But let's talk about the unification card again, because the numbers involved paint a picture of David and Goliath. Only this time, they are sitting at a negotiating table rather than a battlefield. To understand the gravity of a potential union between Romania and Moldova, you have to look at the raw economic firepower. On one side, you have Romania, a fully integrated EU member with a GDP of roughly $284 billion according to 2021 data. It is a state with modern infrastructure, a NATO standard military, and access to the vast single market. On the other side, you have Moldova, scrapping by with an economy of only $14 billion, a fraction of its neighbor's wealth. On paper, it looks like a hostile takeover, or at best, a charity case where the rich brother adopts the poor one. The disparity is so massive that financial analysts in Bucharest worry about the cost of absorption. Integrating Moldova would be an expensive project, requiring billions in infrastructure investment to bring roads, hospitals, and power grids up to EU standards. It is a unification that appeals to the heart, but terrifies the treasury. However, the ledger has a second column that favors Chisinau. Romania has a bleeding wound that no amount of GDP growth can fix, a demographic crisis. Bucharest is struggling with plummeting birth rates and a massive brain drain as its young workforce migrates west for higher salaries. In this context, Moldova's population of 2.6 million people isn't a burden. It is a demographic vaccine. It represents a pool of culturally compatible, linguistically identical labor that could plug the gaps in the Romanian economy. This isn't just about land, it's about the survival of the nation-state in a shrinking Europe. The pulse of the street confirms that this calculation is taking root. 10 years ago, unification was a fringe idea, a romantic notion held by maybe 15 to 20% of Moldovans. It was something you talked about after a few drinks, not in parliament. Today, polling suggests that figure has surged to over 40%. As the shadow of Russian aggression lengthens across the Black Sea, the Romanian umbrella stops looking like a loss of independence and starts looking like the only storm shelter left standing. Fear is a powerful motivator, and right now, fear is driving Moldova into Romania's arms faster than any politician ever could. This brings us to the military transformation, which is perhaps the most surprising plot twist of all. If you looked at the Moldovan army in 1992, you would have seen a glorified militia with rusty AK-47s and no clear chain of command. It was a force that existed in name only. Fast forward to today, and the picture has sharpened significantly. Utilizing resources from the European Peace Facility, Moldova has begun a crash course in modernization. We aren't just talking about new uniforms. We are talking about French radar systems capable of tracking Russian cruise missiles, German armored vehicles that actually start when you turn the key, and American intelligence support that provides real-time situational awareness. Chisinau is building a military that is interoperable with NATO standards. They are training with Western advisors, learning modern urban combat tactics, and integrating into the Western security architecture. It is no longer a helpless victim waiting to be saved. This shift changes the calculus for any Russian planner. In the past, a few battalions of peacekeepers might have been enough to intimidate Chisinau. Now, any aggression would be met by a force that can shoot back with precision, guided by the best intelligence sensors in the world. And what can Russia do about this? The toolkit that Vladimir Putin has relied on for 20 years is empty. In the old days, the threat was simple. Do what we say, or we turn off the gas. It was a blunt instrument, but effective. But Moldova has spent the last few years aggressively diversifying its energy portfolio. They have connected to the European ENTSO-E electricity grid, effectively plugging themselves into the continental power supply. They have secured gas contracts with non-Russian suppliers, storing reserves in Ukraine and in Romania. The gas weapon has been disarmed. What remains? Hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, and the activation of provocateurs in Transnistria. But even here, the returns are diminishing. The close cooperation between Ukrainian and Moldovan intelligence services means that Russian plots are often dismantled before they even leave the planning stage. Kiev treats the Moldovan border with the same paranoid intensity as its eastern front, because they know that a secure rear is essential for the defense of Odessa. The Ukrainian view is clear. Our security cannot be fully ensured without neutralizing the Transnistrian threat. This alignment of interests has created a security shield around Moldova that hybrid tactics simply cannot penetrate. The wargaming scenarios currently sitting on desks in Brussels and Washington paint a bleak picture for the Kremlin, as the future of this breakaway strip involves a calculated set of probabilities where winning is no longer an option. The first scenario, and arguably the most rational one, involves Russia quietly swallowing the bitter pill of acceptance, allowing Transnistria to gradually reintegrate into Moldova while perhaps retaining some token special status to save face. This would be a humiliating retreat, a public admission that the Russian bear no longer has the claws to hold on to its periphery, effectively signaling that Moscow can not afford the rent on its overseas bases. The second scenario is the one that keeps intelligence officers awake at 3 a.m. a false flag operation where Russia stages a provocation to justify escalation. However, in 2026, this is a strategic trap. With 1,500 lightly equipped soldiers facing a battle-hardened Ukrainian army, any provocation would likely result in a police action rather than a war, leading to the neutralization of the Russian garrison in hours. The third scenario, a Russian land bridge punching through Odessa to link up with Tiraspol, has fallen into the realm of science fiction. The calcified front lines and Ukraine's defensive depth mean any force attempting such a breakthrough would be ground to dust long before seeing the spires of Chisinau. This entire siege serves as the definitive case study of 21st century warfare, proving that modern victories are won not with hypersonic missiles, but with the unsexy tools of bureaucracy, customs protocols, energy tariffs, and buoyant legal frameworks. Ukraine and Moldova have effectively reverse-engineered Russia's favorite weapon, hybrid warfare, and turned it against its inventor, forcing the enemy to capitulate without ever pulling a trigger. It is a masterclass in Sun Tzu's philosophy. To defeat the enemy without fighting is the pinnacle of mastery. The Russian garrison isn't being bombed, it is being audited into submission, fighting boredom and irrelevance rather than enemy fire. Furthermore, the environmental gun held to the region's head, the massive Cobasna ammunition depot holding 20,000 tons of decaying Soviet-era munitions, has transformed from a strategic asset into a liability of nuclear proportions. Moscow's deafening silence on securing or upgrading this ticking time bomb reveals the behavior of a squatter who knows eviction is imminent and has ceased all maintenance, hoping the laws of chemistry simply take a day off. In the end, separatist leader Vadim Krasnoselsky's calls for constructive dialogue sound less like diplomacy and more like a captain radioing for a lifeboat, as local elites realize their survival lies in cutting a deal with the West rather than waiting for orders from a contracting East. We are witnessing the dismantling of the Soviet legacy not with a sledgehammer, but with the quiet scratch of a signature on a customs declaration form. The Russian world in Eastern Europe is ending with a transaction declined notification. The question that remains is whether a humiliated Kremlin will quietly pack up, or if they will decide that if they can't have Transnistria, no one can, and attempt to set the region ablaze on their way out. As Moldova inches toward a potential union with Romania that would redraw the map of the European Union, the fuse is burning and the clock is ticking. But for the first time in decades, the detonator isn't in Moscow's hands.